Okay, I think we're good to go. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Thip Khao talk. I'm your moderator, Kasey Chaleunsouk. I have here our very special guest, Titus Peachey, that I will shortly introduce. But before we start, I just want to give our online community a little bit of a background on what is Thip Khao talk. So Thip Khao talk is through Legacies of War, as you found yourself here on the website. It's Legacies of War was founded in 2004, following the recovery of a set of original drawings by bombing survivors in Laos during the Vietnam War from the 1960s to 1970s. And the drawings and the history behind them inspired the formation of the only US-based organization solely dedicated to raising awareness about the US-Vietnam War era bombings in Laos and the vast amount of unexploded ordnance, or UXO, that remains in the country 45 years later. And just sharing more about the mission of Legacies, our mission is to raise awareness about the history of the Vietnam War era bombing in Laos and to advocate for the clearance of unexploded bombs and survivor assistance. We're here to provide space for healing the wounds of war and to create greater hope for a future of peace. Without further ado, I like to give our amazing introduction to our very special guest, Titus Peachey, who has been involved with Legacies of War since its beginning in 2004, when he got the call from Chanapa Kamongsa. Titus and his wife, Linda, were the directors of the Mennonite Central Committee, MCC aid program in Laos from 1980 to 1985. Titus returned to Laos in 1994 to help coordinate the beginning of the humanitarian demining project in Laos, working alongside the Mines Advisory Group, MAG, and the Laos Committee for Social and Veterans Affairs. He is recently retired Director of Peace Education for MCC U.S. And an interesting fact for Titus is that he was born in the Appalachian Hills of Western Maryland in a rural farming community that reminded him a lot of Siem Quang, hence his love of Siem Quang. Well, Titus, hello, how are you? I'm from New York, and can you give us the online community your hello, and where are you right now?
Okay, can you see me? I'm not being able to see myself. Can you see me?
Yes, I could see
okay.
you.
No problem. All right. Yes, I'm Titus Peachey. I live in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And maybe what I'll do, just out of such deep appreciation for the amazing welcome and hospitality we received in Laos from people in Laos, as well as the real joy and meaning I've had in relating to Laotian Americans here through Legacies of War, I'd just like to offer a few words of greeting in Lao, essentially repeating what you've said, Kasey, by way of introduction. So I'll do that, and then we can get started with questions. สบายดีหมดทุกคนที่ฮักแพงเด้อข้าพเจ้าชื่อ Titus Peachey และอยู่ Lancaster Pennsylvania แต่ปี1980ฮอด85ข้าพเจ้าพร้อมด้วยเมียได้ไปเฮ็ดเวียกอยู่ประเทศลาวพวกเขาเฮ็ดเวียกนำองค์การ Mennonite ที่เป็นองค์การช่วยเหลือเอกชนหมายความว่าบ่ได้ขึ้นกับรัฐบาลแต่เป็นเอกชนเนาะต่างหากพวกเขาให้ความช่วยเหลือด้านกสิกรรมแดงศึกษาสาธารณและสวัสดิการสังคมแต่ปัญหาต้นต่อในเวลานั้นเป็นปัญหาระเบิดที่บ่ทันได้แตกที่ยังคงค้างอยู่ดินลาวต่อมาอีก10 ปีข้าพเจ้ากลับคืนประเทศลาวเพื่อช่วยจัดตั้งโครงการเก็บกู้ระเบิดเวลานั้นข้าพเจ้าประสานงานกับรัฐบาลลาวและองค์การ MAG Mines Advisory Group เดี๋ยวนี้ข้าพเจ้าเลิกการแล้วเพราะว่าเท่าไรเนาะแต่ยังเป็นสมาชิกของคณะของ Legacies of War และมื้อนี้ข้าพเจ้าดีใจที่สุดที่มีโอกาสเล่าเรื่องประสบการณ์ของพวกเขาในเวลาพวกเขาเฮ็ดเวียกอยู่ประเทศลาวขอบใจเด้อ Okay, I think my brain is rewired now.
ขอบใจหลายเด้อ Titus ภาษาลาวเจ้าเก่งก่อนขน้อยแต่เว้าแล้วบ่ลังเทื่อมันบ่อยากแจ้งso ขอโทษตอนในเว้าภาษาอังกฤษเด้อinterview มื้อนี้
Okay.
So we'll get started. Titus, again, thank you so much for sharing your perspective in Laos, starting from the 1980s. You know, your experience is just. I just want to express my personal gratitude. You know, I was born in 1983 in Vientiane, and during that time, you were in Laos, and so we had this conversation before that. You know, your perspective is filling in the gap from what I didn't have and would, you know, crave. You know, especially I could speak for my generation here as a Lao American. So I really want to say a big thank you for, you know, for being here today and sharing with us your perspective and experience in Laos. So, you know, how about we start from the beginning, when you first arrived in Laos. You know, take us back and how was that experience?
Okay. Well, just a couple things. First, I wanted to just emphasize that this was an experience that my wife and I shared together. Linda and I were co-country representatives for Mennonite Central Committee. The Lao government folks used to ask us, well, who's the real boss? Menpipe and Huanat had, you know. And we would always say, no, we're co-representatives, co-directors. It was a pattern that the Quakers in Laos also had. So over the years, they certainly came to understand that and respect that, for which we were grateful. And the other thing is, we were not there alone by ourselves in the sense that we were doing this as individuals. We were representing Mennonite Central Committee, an organization that provided our support and encouragement and guidance along the way. It was an agency that not only valued relief and development, but also things like peace and peacemaking and building bridges between people who had been, or nations that had been estranged. So we very much valued that support. Finally, what I will share, obviously, I mean, it goes without saying, is through the eyes of a foreigner. We grew up in the U.S., of course, and so brought that lens to our experience in Laos, and I'm sure we missed many nuances and many things along the way. So just to acknowledge that before we get started. Laos was a very interesting place to be at that particular period of time. The war ended in 1975, but the trauma of the war was still with people very much. Many thousands of people had left the country as refugees. Many people who had stayed in Laos had to return to their homes and their villages, which were completely devastated by the war. And so economically, Laos was in a very difficult spot at that time. And relationships with the United States, while never broken, the U.S. Embassy was still there in a very small contingent. But relationships were very difficult and very strained. So there were 6 or 7 U.S. Citizens working at the embassy. And then in addition to that, it was 2 Mennonites and 2 Quakers. So there were about a dozen, 10 to 12 U.S. citizens in the country. No tourism, a lot of Eastern Bloc and Soviet folks. So when Linda and I rode our motorcycle around Vientiane, you know, the kids would smile and point and say, Soviet, Soviet.
Was it a friendly hello, like Soviet, like, you know, because that was the sense of familiarity for them?
Well, you know, that's one of the nuances I wish I knew more about. Yeah, it was, I think they sort of, well, the other thing they said was Falan.
Right.
Was in general the term used for foreigner, although under the previous regime and during the time that Laos was part of French Indochina, it was, you know, meaning French, but, you know, any foreigner was assumed to be French at that time. So sometimes it was Soviet, sometimes it was French. So the first years that MCC was in Laos from 75 to 80, it was very difficult to move around much or to actually do a lot of work. But during the time that Linda and I were there from 80 to 85, things began to relax a lot more, and it really became possible to move around the country. And during that time, we visited, I think, almost every province in Laos, from Phongsali in the north all the way down to Atapu in the south. So we felt very privileged to be able to have that kind of access to the countryside, to villages, to people, to understand what was happening and what was going on. And like I said, I felt were always received very, very generously by people, for which we were very grateful. So
that's amazing. And how did you get around when you first arrived in Laos? Was it by car, or did you have to take a plane? How was the
Well,
logistics?
generally speaking, we would fly to the province where we were going to do our work, but it depended a little bit. Like we would fly to Luang Prabang, but then if we were going to work up in Pong Sali, for example, we'd take a 3-day boat trip from Luang Prabang up the U River to Pong Sali.
Wow.
Or if we were going to a Huapan, sometimes we would fly all the way to Huapan, but many times we'd fly to Sian Quang and then go by road, which was another day over a very rough road up to Huapan province. So within provinces, generally by road or by boat, but between the Vientiane and another province, we would frequently fly.
Wow.
And sometimes it was an old Soviet Antonov 12, I guess, which was a biplane with 12 seats, or a helicopter, or sometimes a regular airplane.
Wow. Did you feel safe in those?
More or less. More or less, yeah.
Yeah, that's the I for me it's I was in Laos recently, and the roads have improved a lot. We'll get more into the current present later on in our conversation, but I can imagine the journey that you took, flying to these remote destinations.
And these visits were sometimes 1 week long, sometimes 3 weeks long. So, to be gone from Vientiane for 3 weeks and basically, at the mercy of the arrangements that other people were making for you was sometimes quite an adventure.
And did you have a local person that accompanied you to the visits?
We would always have somebody from one of the government ministries that would go with us. And so if we were working with agriculture, it would be somebody from the ag ministry or somebody from social welfare. And they often sent fairly low-level officials, which meant protocol was very minimal. And it also often meant that they would send somebody who was from the province to which we were traveling. So that really helped with ease of arrangements. It's not like, there were private hotels and restaurants where you could go and just show up and there would be a place to stay or things to eat.
Right.
You'd stay in a government-run guest house or in a village. We'd show up with our chickens and a pig and hand it over to the villagers, and then that would be our meal.
Wow.
So that we would try to, make arrangements so that we would help to provide for ourselves in the process. So it was a very, very basic, kind of like glorified camping sometimes.
Did you have any expectations before your visits? Like, were you prepped in terms of these are the local customs that you would have to be aware of? I know you were in Vietnam prior to this, and so were there any major differences, with the first visits to the villages?
Without going into a lot of detail between Vietnam and Laos, I mean, Vietnam is a very different situation because I was there during the war, also working with the Mennonites at the time. So the situation was very different. Generally speaking, I found Lao culture to be a bit more relaxed and informal, a bit easier to enter than Vietnamese culture was. Yeah, since we traveled with somebody from one of the local provinces, that really helped in terms of making introductions. They had always notified local provincial officials in advance that we were coming so that we would be expected. And then they would normally have a plan of where we would go, what we would see, and what they had in mind in terms of what MCC assistance might be. We often worked with institutions like teachers training colleges or agricultural schools or hospitals, and somewhat in villages, although it wasn't possible at that time to really establish a long-term relationship in a local area and settle down and do development like we understand it today. Teachers training colleges or ag schools were often set up out in the countryside because they wanted to extend literacy. They wanted to extend good agricultural practices out into the villages. But these were very, very rustic settings in which to have a school. You know, sometimes these students would come, they'd have to build their own dormitories out of bamboo, they'd have to plant gardens, they'd have to look for firewood, they'd have to go fishing in the river. So our assistance at that time was largely things like mosquito nets, blankets, kitchen equipment, and some basic visual aids for learning like anatomical charts or chemical charts and things like that, just so that the living conditions would be easier and healthy so that the students could devote more time to learning. We could also provide materials for like a clean drinking water system. If there was a spring up in the mountains, we would provide the plastic PVC tubing and cement, and then the local folks would provide all the labor and do that. So,
I just want to give a shout out because we didn't, I apologize, we didn't mention the Midsummer Memories. So some of our viewers may have read, which, is like a great primer to this conversation today. And Midsummer Memories, you write about your initial experience and subsequent visits to the villages. And you mentioned, is this the gravity feed water drinking system? I wasn't sure what that entailed.
Well, it just means that there's a spring in the mountain above the village or above the school. And so there's no pump required, no electrical pump or mechanical pump or anything. You simply build a cement, what do you call it, a container to sort of trap the water initially. And then a long pipe, maybe 1,000 meters or 1,200 meters from that basin down to the village. And then there might be 1 or 2 or 3 standpipes, faucets in the village where people can gather and open the faucet and get water right there, rather than having to hike down to the river or up the mountain to the spring. So that provided greater convenience and access to clean drinking water or cleaning water for cleaning in a village like that. And what we would do is we would import the things that weren't available in the country. So we would contact export-import companies in Vientiane with a list of things that would be required for a particular project, make the arrangements, pay for the goods, have it imported, and then we would notify the project people in the provinces when the goods had arrived in Vientiane. And then they would send a truck, we would go to the customs area in Tanalang together, and they would load up their truck and transport it back to their province. And then after they had set things up, we would come back and make a return visit just to verify what had been done with the materials, see if there were any additional needs or problems. That way we could develop a bit of a relationship and make sure that things got to where they were supposed to go.
That's amazing. And did you go back for subsequent projects aside from providing clean drinking water? Like you mentioned earlier, there was the education component and
yeah, some of the institutions in particular, we would have return visits on multiple occasions to address additional issues. And then there were other things like one of the things that Linda worked with is somebody, I think in Thailand, had managed to get a book called Where There Is No Doctor, which is a primary health care book translated into Lao. I think it might have been World Vision, I'm not sure. And so Linda worked with the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health in Laos to have that translation reviewed, adapted as necessary, and then published in Lao for Lao healthcare workers. Our language tutors in Vientiane, we studied language for a couple years in addition to beginning to do our work. Both of them were medical students. And so we learned a lot about the healthcare system in Laos and about the needs of medical workers. And often they would graduate from medical school and all they had were their notes. And they didn't really have, good medical journals or access to research documents or even basic material in Lao to guide them as they went out to practice. And so this book we felt would be really helpful in filling a need for primary healthcare workers in Laos. So that's the kind of project, which involved working with Ministry of Health and Ministry of Education, pardon me, rather than more at the local level or at a school. But it would have an important impact across the country in that way.
And was that at the same time when you started learning Lao and developing the language?
Well, we started with the language. We were actually in Thailand for 6 months before we ever went to Laos. And we went to a Thai language school for 3 months to learn Thai. And then when we got to Vientiane, there was no Lao language school that we could go to in Vientiane. So we hired tutors to come to our house. We probably spent 6 to 10 hours a week for 2 years with our tutors studying Lao, and then we would often share a meal with them and have endless long conversations about Laos, about culture, about folk tales, about religion, all kinds of things. So we really developed a very close relationship with them and learned a lot from them. But all this time, we were also starting to work with our various government ministries. And of course, initially our Lao language ability was very limited, and we did a lot of stumbling around.
Yeah.
As you might imagine. But it improved with time, and especially when we took our 2 and 3 week trips, we came back with very tired brains.
Wow.
But it was a lot of help in terms of improving our language ability.
And in your article, the Midsummer Memories, you do give us some experience moments that had an impact on your mission. Do you want to talk more about that and when you went out there? And I also want to ask our audience members that please ask questions anytime. If you have any questions for Titus, please just message us and I'll make sure to bring it up. But Titus, yes, for you, like from what was your fondest memory
I'll tell you the story of the one time I went to Hua Phan province. Hua Phan is way up in the northeast next to the Vietnamese border. It's the area where the Lao Revolution sort of had its center or its seat. The caves in Vieng Sai are the historic areas where the Pathet Lao folks had their government seat, and they operated out of the caves. So I went on this trip, and they wanted to take me. It was with the Ministry of Agriculture, and the local ag committee wanted to take me to Sam Tai, which in Hua Phan they call Sam Tau. And it was about a day's journey out of Hua Phan over very rough roads and mountains. We occasionally had to stop, and somebody had to take a machete and cut down a tree branch that had fallen across the road. And we actually didn't make it on the first day because a truck ahead of us got stuck trying to negotiate a curve in the mud, and so we had to stay in a village overnight. Finally got to the district of Sam Tau the next day, and the district head was amazed that we got there. He said, "Oh, like Hun Ma Bo Hot Dog." A lot of people come, but they never get here.
I don't know if that's a welcoming statement or a warning.
Yeah. So anyway, they wanted to. This was one of the trips I had where it felt like they had no problem at all assuming that I could do anything. A lot of times we'd go to another province, we'd fly to Luang Prabang, which was about a 40-minute flight, 45-minute flight. And we'd get there and they'd say, "Oh, you must be very tired. You had this long trip. You just rest for the rest of the day. We'll come and see you tomorrow." Well, not in Sam Tau. We went to work right away. And they wanted to take me to this village, which was down the river. So we got ready to go, and it was raining, but we went anyway. We went through, a steady drizzle, took off our shoes and socks, walked through ankle-deep mud down to the river, got in this tiny little dugout boat, and went down this river. It was rainy season. The river was, raging. The water came within a couple inches of the top of the boat. And we had a meeting in this village, and we ate lovely Lao meal. And then we had to walk back because we couldn't go by boat upstream. And it was a 7-kilometer walk. And so we walked back this muddy path in our bare feet, and we got back to where the village was, the district headquarters was, and we had to cross the river. well, we had to cross the river, and it was at least waist deep, maybe chest deep. So we took off our shirts and our pants, and we walked across the river hanging onto this cable so we wouldn't get washed away. And I was like, I just felt so invigorated because I was experiencing life in rural Laos. And I said, my, this is fun. And they were like, what do you mean this is fun? This is no fun at all. We have to do this every day. This is hard. We're so tired of this. This is miserable.
Hmm.
I realized there I was, with my foreign lens, my foreign eyes. This was a nice diversion from my typical life in Vientiane. But for people in Laos, this was reality, and it was hard. They had to wrestle every day with the basic elements of life, trying to make a living, plant their rice amidst the rains and the dry season, make sure that their families had enough to eat. The place was very mountainous and hilly. They had to search for firewood. They had to raise gardens. There were bombs in the soil. All of this stuff they had to deal with was reality for them, and it was hard. And
Right.
I was not experiencing it at all the way they were. So that was a real lesson to me. Slow down. Think a little bit about how what you're experiencing is being experienced by Lao people. We were experiencing the same experience, the same geography, but through totally different lens. So it taught me that I still had a lot to learn as a foreigner in Laos about what Lao people were experiencing. So that was an important lesson.
That is an amazing story, Titus. You do mention also that there was a gentleman that really you had in terms of the hospitality, as you mentioned, and also like the burden that the Lao people have, or during that time was even worse, where there was so much unknown of the land they were tilling, and did you ever feel that it was like a hopeless situation, or how did you process it and kind of plan out what you can contribute to ease the pain?
Well, we certainly had to take our cues from people in Laos, from the government ministries, and from the people in the schools and the villages that we visited as to what they saw as their most important needs. I remember one time I was visiting this village in Luang Prabang, and many of the people had suffered handicaps because of the war. And at the end of our visit, they were talking about various needs that they had, and I was sure they were going to ask for a pickup truck, because that was sort of the ubiquitous request that people wanted to ask for. So I was kind of bracing myself, and here they asked for an ox cart. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, we could do an ox cart. That would be helpful. But let me tell you the story of one man we related to a lot. His name was Mr. Bovan, and he was in Siêng Khoang province, and he worked for the local Siêng Khoang province social welfare committee. And we worked with him a lot around various needs, but he had a particular concern about the problem of unexploded bombs, because Siêng Khoang was bombed very heavily. And he was very concerned that we figure out a way to address that issue. And he had lived in Siêng Khoang throughout all the war years. He hadn't left. People who did not leave areas that were bombed often lived in caves. I talked to villagers who lived in caves for 9 years.
Wow.
They would go out early in the morning to plant their rice and get back into the cave before the bombs started falling. He talked about having dug holes along village paths so that in case they were walking and they heard an airplane, they could quick duck into a hole. Other villages talked about if they had to walk between villages, they would carry a tree branch with them. And then if they heard an airplane, they would hold very still and just hold the tree branch.
Wow, as camouflage,
camouflage.
From the airplanes.
Yeah. So this man, lived with that reality throughout all the war years, and in all the times that I worked with him, and it was, many, many trips to Siêng Khoang. So I got to know him quite well. We would eat meals together, travel together, take baths in the river at the same time. So we got to know each other very well. Anytime that he would mention America, the word imperialist was linked to it. He would always say Jakapat America. I never heard him say the word America without saying Jakapat imperialist alongside it. That was just his lived reality. It was what he knew. That was his world.
Was there anger? Was there anger in the when he said imperialist to you,
no,
or more?
It was like he would be saying, the American nation or the American community, the American imperialist. I mean, it was just Jakapat America. Our relationship, our personal relationship, was very cordial. We got along together well. Just an illustration of that. One time during one of my visits, and this was the time in probably late 1982 sometime, we were talking and I explained that Linda was pregnant and I was going to be a father for the first time. So we talked about that a bit. And I was at the airport waiting to return on the helicopter, waiting to get on the helicopter. And here comes Mr. Buolan running. He's carrying this basket. And he gives me the basket and he says, take this to Linda. It'll help keep her strong and make sure the baby is healthy. And inside the basket was a live duck for Linda.
Did he give instructions with the duck, or what was your?
No, we didn't need any instructions. We gave it. We had a Lao woman who did some cooking for us. She worked for us half days, did some cooking and marketing for us. So we gave it to her, and she prepared the duck. So that was not a problem.
That is an amazing Lao hospitality. Meeting someone for the first time, and I could speak for my family, even though we don't see each other for a long time, but you reconnect immediately, and any friends you bring to visit, they consider them family. So that is something that's a very special thing for Lao people.
Well, Linda had met him too, because she had traveled to Siem Quang, so he knew who she was, and so there was also that relationship. But yeah, that's just very indicative of the kind of hospitality that we experienced while living and working in Laos. Despite the war and who we may have represented, we always felt very welcome personally.
Can we give a little bit? I think some of our viewers may not know about the Mennonite community. What would you say is like the major focus of the Mennonite community, especially work overseas?
Well, I guess we would be in some ways similar to many Christian church denominations in terms of our set of beliefs and theology. The one thing that might be unique is our emphasis on service and our emphasis on peacemaking. So, for example, in the year 1970, when I was 20 years old, I dropped out of college. The Vietnam War was raging, and so I was subject to the draft. I was taught from little up that because of our commitment to our faith and to understanding how Jesus taught us to live, that I should never go to war as a soldier, but that I should do something else instead. So I went to Vietnam, not as a soldier, but as an English teacher to teach English to high school and university students, working with a Mennonite agency to do that. And during the Vietnam War era, a lot of Mennonite young men and young women, but young men to fulfill their obligation to selective service, did all kinds of work in overseas and U.S. settings, in hospitals, in schools, in mental health facilities, in development projects, all around the world and in the U.S. So that just became almost a rite of passage for young Mennonite men during that time period. It was just part of the reality that I grew up with. And so while that has diminished now in the years since there's not been a draft, many young men have not been required to do that. But still, that's been a lingering emphasis and commitment on the part of many Mennonites.
That is amazing, cross culture, and yet, the universal need for peace is something that is everyone can relate. And I'm sure your experience with, your stories that you have shared with the various missions that you went on in Laos attests to that desire for peace. And and for you, from this experience, and did you see it as like a long-term commitment? And if so, did you have a vision of what that could be?
Well, when I went to Vietnam for 3 years, I viewed that as short term.
Mm-hmm.
And back then they viewed that as a short term thing, a 3-year commitment. And I didn't know what would happen after that. But after that, I was very much interested in doing something similarly, perhaps a bit longer.
Mm-hmm.
I think in Vietnam, because while I obviously was not a soldier and did not see the war the way a soldier saw the war, I saw many of the sights and sounds and impacts of war. And one thing I saw a lot of was B-52 bombers flying north, either to North Vietnam or to Laos. So I had an intense concern and curiosity about what was life like on the other side of those bombs. So the opportunity to go to Laos gave me the opportunity to experience that. And I think the other thing that experience in Vietnam and Laos did was made me much more aware of and interested in systems and structures that influence our lives and shape the lives of people. And that in order to be committed to peacemaking, involves a lot more than simply making peace between myself and another individual that I might be having a conflict with. But it also means addressing systems and structures of oppression and colonialism and violence that are very large and driven by economics and politics and all kinds of things and can be overwhelming. But it made me realize that in order to carry out some of the concerns that I had developed related to peacemaking, I have to be aware of and address some of those systems and structures. And also just one more comment I wanted to make, and that is that we in the Mennonite community have had to learn so much. We've not done things perfectly in our efforts to do service and peacemaking in the U.S. or overseas. And our impulse has been much more towards service and peacemaking, and not nearly as much as toward justice. And I guess the longer I've lived, the more I realize the importance of addressing justice issues alongside service and peacemaking. So I want to be very humble about the impact that we've had and acknowledge that we've had a lot to learn and still have a lot to learn, particularly in the area of justice.
And that's a very good the word justice. How do you see justice for Lao and we started getting involved with the UXO project? Can you talk more about that and
Yeah. I think the best way I can talk about that is to talk a little bit more about our experiences in addressing the problem of the bombs. When we walked into a Lao village in northern Laos, we were oftentimes maybe the first U.S. citizens these people had seen since the bombs had fallen. And we were very aware of that. We were very aware of that because the signs of the war were everywhere in the village. There were, of course, bomb craters in the rice fields and in the gardens and in the village, everywhere. There were bomb containers scattered around the village used as feeders for cattle or planters for herbs or stilts for houses or fences or granaries. And some of the bomb containers still had the names of the U.S. companies that had produced the bombs. So we saw, like the corporate America calling cards in these bomb containers from Coleman, Alabama, or Camden, Arkansas, or Downey, California. And it was the strangest thing to be in these villages without electricity, without machinery. And here was this high-tech weaponry from the U.S. laying around that was lethal. And villagers would show us areas where there were more unexploded bombs that hadn't blown up yet along a village path or on a hillside or in a pasture, or areas that they couldn't open up for gardening or farming because there were just too many bombs there. And then they would tell us about children that had played with a bomb and had been killed. They would show us the pictures of children who had been lost, or parents or spouses. One of the first trips Linda took to Siem Quang province, they took her to Muang Kam to visit a family that had lost their mother the day before. She was the mother of 11 children. And they took her out to the garden to show her where the accident had happened. They gave her the hoe head that the woman was using, and the hoe head was shattered, broken. And they said, take this hoe head back to the United States, to your country, and use it to tell our story, because we don't want it to happen to other people. So it's like this Lao villager understood advocacy. I was amazed. He understood the power of personal story and the need for systems of power to hear that story so that policies could change. So all of this was running around in our heads as we visited these villages. And it was like the question of who's responsible for this kind of hung in the air as we talked to villagers about the war and about the bombs and about the problems that they experienced. And I don't remember exactly the first time that this happened, but it slowly began to dawn on us that many times as we sat in a village and ate meals together, you know, wonderful Lao foods with sticky rice and soup broth and spicy sauces that sort of woke up your taste buds all at once.
I haven't had lunch, so you're making me hungry.
Yeah, you know, it would slowly dawn on us that the cups and the spoons and the plates that they were serving this food on were made from melted down bomb containers and dispenser tubes. So they had taken the weapons of war intended to kill them and transformed them into instruments of hospitality to offer nourishment and life and well-being to us, who represented the country that had bombed them. And they did this knowing full well that there were more bombs outside the door threatening the lives and the lives of their children. And we will never know what deep inner work these dear people had to go through internally in their souls and in their spirits in order to offer us that hospitality. And I don't think they used the spoons and the utensils made from bomb containers as a way to make a point. They had simply gathered together the materials that were in their environment in order to survive, and that's what they had. But the symbolism was so powerful to us that we could never forget that, because it enabled our relationship to be based not on the resentment and anger of war, but on hospitality, on welcome, on kindness, on generosity. And we were just always so moved and so grateful for that. And it has become a lesson that is really important and yet really difficult to implement in our own lives, in our own relationships, and in the systems that we struggle with. How do we speak truth? How do we speak justice? How do we act in ways that will restore life and wholeness and relationship while also being honest about what has happened?
And during this time, was there any commitment from the U.S. to help, alleviate the pain from the UXOs?
Good question. That's always something that we worked on. We obviously had relationships with the U.S. Embassy in Vientiane and with their staff people, with the Charge d'Affaires. And so we would talk to them about our experiences and what we saw in the villages, and we would certainly encourage, the U.S. government to get involved and to provide assistance. I think at one point during our time in Laos, there was a delegation from the U.S. that offered some assistance. I know relationships were such that the Lao government was not always eager or ready for U.S. assistance in that particular area, because I think U.S. assistance likely would have meant U.S. military personnel trained in ordnance disposal, coming to do the work. And that's not something Laos was ready for at that point. Later on, as Laos opened up its, one of the U.S. requests or demands was for Laos to help the U.S. search for the remains of pilots, U.S. pilots that had been shot down during the war.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the request from the U.S. side.
Mm.
And so these two requests kept going back and forth, and gradually enough trust was built that Laos was able to assist the U.S. in searching for lost pilots. And this was then after, well, later on, the U.S. began to offer some assistance in the area of bomb disposal.
And during about what time was this? I know we started in the early 1980s, and then when the U.S. started engaging and having dialogue with the government.
That did not happen until later on in the late 1990s, but I need to back up.
Mm-hmm.
So we were there from 1980 to 1985, and that's when we had these experiences in the villages, and we tried various things. We tried various ways to try to address the issue, but not very successfully.
Mm.
So then we came home, other MCC workers worked there, and finally in 1994, MCC invited the Mines Advisory Group, which was a humanitarian demining agency that at that time was working next door in Cambodia to clean landmines,
Mm-hmm.
to come to Laos. And because when we were there was no humanitarian demining agency like MAG, but they formed in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So MCC invited them to come in 1994, and that's when I went back for 6 months to work alongside the Mines Advisory Group. They sent two ordnance disposal experts from the UK along with an administrator. And I, on the MCC side, worked together with the Lao government to begin an ordnance clearance project. We set it up in 6 months' time. We hired local Lao villagers, did training, and set them to work in doing clearance work under the guidance of the ordnance experts from the UK. And then it was after that got started that the U.S. then began to support the project. It was all supported by MCC initially, mm-hmm. but then the U.S. government and other governments got involved, and it got much, much bigger than MCC could ever hope to sustain on a long-term basis. So MCC was the catalyst along with MAG and the Lao government, and then the U.S. government and other governments got involved. And then we get to Legacies mm-hmm. in 2004.
We do have some questions from our online community. Before we move with go forward and talk about more your involvement with Legacies, there's a question from Roger Ehrlich. The reuse of bomb boxes and other legacies of the American war on Southeast Asia in creative ways is very inspiring. Has anyone documented these sword to plowshares transformations, favorite examples, memorials?
I don't know if there's anything permanent, but there was a traveling exhibit of this swords to plowshares a number of years ago that traveled around the country as part of an education project. Where all that stuff ended up, I'm not sure. So I don't know if it's available anywhere at this point, although I know Legacies of War has some of those materials, and Legacies of War has a traveling exhibit as well, but it is set up, only by arrangement and by request. So you might check with Legacies to see what might be possible, and some of that material would be available there.
Great. And speaking of Legacies of War, Legacies has been great at telling the story. Let's just, I guess, how did you, in that initial, your beginnings at Legacies of War, can you kind of give us that?
Yeah, I was sitting in my office one day at MCC, and Chanapa Kambongsa, who's the founder of Legacies, called me because she heard that Mennonites had been involved in Laos and involved with the cluster bomb problem years earlier. And so she was reaching out to MCC to see if we would have any interest in what she was doing. She had gotten a hold of the drawings that Fred Brantman had collected along with Mr. Nguyen, his Lao counterpart, from refugees from the bombing in Siang Quang. And she was just fascinated by this, and she can tell that story better than I, but that's how I became involved with Legacies in 2004. And in the initial years, we did a lot of education and advocacy among Laotian diaspora here in the US, as well as among the US people, because the air war in Laos was a secret war and not well known. So we wanted to do a lot of awareness raising. Mm-hmm. And then along about 2008, we really began working very hard to do advocacy in Washington, D.C. to get the U.S. government to give greater support for bomb clearance and victim assistance in Laos. And at that time, the U.S. was giving anywhere from $2.5, $3 million a year, which was it had no relationship to the scale of the problem. So we really began to work with the legislation. Laotian Americans around the country contacted their representatives and their senators' offices, and gradually began to increase support. And that increased until 2016, when President Obama visited Laos and made this big announcement that the U.S. would now give $30 million a year over 3 years for a total of $90 million. And so that was the big leap that then
That's amazing.
really began to address the problem in a real way.
Right, and just to that money, the committed 90 million, is to do a comprehensive survey, correct, of the to truly understand the devastation that was of the UXOs in Laos.
Well, it's used in several different ways. One is to do a survey to get a very detailed accounting of how much still needs to be done. And there are, from all counts, millions of bombs still left in the soil these 35 years, 40 years later. The other way it's used is to do actual clearance work. So some of it is used to support clearance teams. And then it's also used, sorry, I need to drink a little water here. It's also used to some degree, and I'm not sure of the percentages here, to provide assistance to survivors. Because as you can imagine, people who suffer injury and lose a limb or suffer internal injuries, sometimes they will need assistance for the rest of their lives. So it's a long-term kind of commitment that's needed. So yes, that funding is used on the ground in Laos. It does not come to Legacies of War at all. We get our funding from people's generous donations and from several small foundations.
And the seed that Legacies planted played a pivotal role in terms of getting the U.S. government involved and really committing, right? Prior to that, it was kind of year to year.
Yes, it was very much year to year. It was very, very small. And I remember Janapa relating that when she talked to the State Department office that handled the funds for demining around the world, she asked them, how come you're not giving more to Laos? The response was, nobody ever asked. So we asked. And I think Legacies has been very effective at doing the ask and doing the education. And many people in the Laotian American community scattered around the country, in Minnesota and California and Texas and Boston and Washington, D.C. and Virginia, have been contacting their own senators and representatives. And that has made a big impact and been very helpful.
And why do you think it's important for Americans, not just Lao Americans, to support Legacies of War and also to support the demining efforts in Laos?
Well, it feels to me like this is a problem that we, knowingly or not, helped to create. There was obviously, another side of the war. There was the North Vietnamese and the Soviets and the Chinese also providing weaponry and the North Vietnamese soldiers. But the primary long-term impact is the unexploded ordnance, and that was primarily U.S. ordnance that was airdropped. There was also artillery and mortars on the ground during the land battles, but the biggest problem is the small unexploded cluster bombers. And so this is a problem that I feel we helped to create, whether we knew it or not. And so when you visit there as a U.S. citizen, you get this strong sense of responsibility to respond in some way to help alleviate the problem. It was almost like when we were in the villages, we could feel this weight on our shoulders as U.S. citizens to respond. So that's how I would view it, that we're part of the system that helped to create that.
And are you optimistic about the future for the UXO removal and really, is there an end date to this? Is there a possibility?
That's the million-dollar question. I am optimistic just because we've made so much progress in terms of awareness raising, education, and the key The key things that gives me optimism is the fact that the casualty numbers have been greatly reduced, greatly reduced. There used to be well over 300 casualties a year, almost one a day. Now it's down to well under 50. And even one is too many. But the casualty rate has come down largely because so many more bombs have been cleared and because there's been a lot more education. And so when villagers find a bomb, they know who to call. And a roving team can come and take care of it. There are still millions of bombs left in the soil. I don't think they will ever totally be cleared, every last bomb. But my hope is that once the survey is done, then the teams can really concentrate on the areas where there are the most bombs, where they can make the biggest impact, and ensure that in those areas where there's a lot of traffic, where people are living and wanting to open up new land, that it can be made safe or cultivation and safe for children, like schoolyards and places like that. I think that's what gives me optimism. Those are the areas that can be concentrated on and cleared, and we have people that have been trained. My hope is that the funding doesn't dry up. We have to keep the pressure on to ensure that the funding is sustained and lasts until the job is done, because we really want to finish the job.
It really brings home the importance of, you know, supporting an organization like Legacies of War and really keeping a light on this issue.
Yes.
So I you know, it's something that I speak for myself as a Laotian American, it was such a new issue having grown up in the U.S. But it's so important that, you know, not just a Lao American, but as an American, that it is a moral obligation. I feel that that we should try to help and support the UXO removal. I think we have another question coming in. Okay. Sorry, there was a buzzer that I received. So if anyone has more questions, well, you know, please do send them our way. Titus, well, we're a few minutes from our scheduled 1 hour. I know there's so much information and so much of your story to tell. Are there more coming out for the Midsummer Memories? I know you shared with us 2 of your stories so far.
Yeah, Midsummer Memories Part 2 has a lot of things in it from this particular interview about visits to villages, my encounters with Mr. Buoban and the duck, Linda's visit to Sien Kwang and the family that lost their mother. So some of those stories are in Midsummer Memories too, which will be coming out shortly. I can't remember what else is in there, if there's anything else that I didn't touch on today or not, but those are some of the ones that I recall being in there.
Terrific. Well, you know, we also would like to direct our viewers to the Legacies of War website, which we'll share and make sure that there's a link on the Facebook page so that people have more questions, want to learn more about, you know, Titus' experience and also the current work that Legacies is doing in shining a light on the issue of UXO in Laos. Please take a look at the website. And I also want to say that we are, you know, right now it's a tough time for everyone with COVID-19. But it's also an opportunity for us to really reflect on what is important to us. So I think that some people have found that giving to an important organization. So hopefully you have learned. Titus, thank you so much for sharing, and hopefully people have been touched and inspired by your stories and want to learn more and how they can help. So I really appreciate your time. We have a few minutes. Is there anything else that you would like for us to know, or you know, kind of how can?
Well, just in terms of personal reflection, this has been one of the more rewarding experiences in my life. To go from Laos in 1980, where there was just sadness, devastation, and danger, to now in 2020, where there are several thousand people working every day clearing bombs in Laos. It's just amazing to me. I'm just so grateful. One whole area of the story, which we didn't even get to touch on at all, is the fact that meanwhile, in the mid to late 2000 to 2008 to 2010, no, 2007, 2008, 2010, there was a movement to ban cluster bombs in an international treaty. The Lao government participated in that. I participated in that on behalf of MCC, and Janapa participated in that on behalf of Legacies. So we actually got to participate in a movement to ban these bombs that had caused so much trouble in Laos. One of the things that was really troubling in the early 2000s, late 1990s, was that while we were clearing bombs in Laos, there were more cluster bombs being dropped in areas like Southern Europe and the Middle East, Central Asia, causing problems in other countries. And the bombs were being dropped there faster than they could be cleaned up in Laos. So we felt like we needed to address the structures that allowed these bombs to be produced. So it was amazing then in 2010 to be back in Vientiane for the first meeting of states parties to this treaties, where there were 1,000 people in a room in Vientiane celebrating the implementation of a treaty to ban the production and use of cluster bombs. Now, the U.S. was not a party to the treaty, but there were over 100 nations that have signed the treaty. So that's a whole other story that is part of this larger story. And it all just gives me so much gratitude and hope.
Wow, amazing. And you know, and you know, I just want to say that from your story, we're not talking about like something in the past. This is really paving the way for the future.
Yeah.
You know, just not having these really dangerous you know, bombs still being manufactured and used around the world. So Laos is an example and also a model of why we should be very careful and be involved with our government of really eradicating such destructive and lasting such a lasting painful legacy for people.
Yeah.
So
I guess my one painful regret is that it took so long. Had we been able to implement things much more quickly, I know certainly many lives could have been saved. But it just took a long time.
Wow. Well, I think you know, that's something for our viewers to ponder. I think that's a good way to close our conversation. But I'm sure there'll be more to come. So I am Titus again. Khop Chai Lai Lai.
Thank you very much. It's
So
been a pleasure.
So is it okay if our viewers have more questions, they could submit to the Facebook page and hopefully we can
Yes,
put
I'll
them
be
together?
happy to respond, certainly.
Okay, terrific. I think that's a wrap for our Thip Khao talk. Again, I would like to thank Titus, you know, for such an amazing perspective and enlightening us this Friday afternoon. So again, please, our viewers, Legacies of War, please check out our website. You can help $5, but it goes a long ways. And so you could hear from Titus how important the work of Legacies is in terms of, you know, shining a light on such a painful history and also charting a path for a brighter future. So thank you, everyone. We really appreciate your time. And thank you again, Titus.